Welcome to Empower You, everyone. I'm Dan Reganold. Educate, enjoy, engage. That's the goal of these free sessions, to help you get you more empowered in your lives. We want to get you involved with important topics tonight, like the pandemic that we've been living in for the past year. So let's start out with a little bit of a chuckle from a good friend of Empower You, Dan, who sent this to me, a couple days ago. I got a good chuckle over it. So we've all probably been called a lot of things over the last several months, but just remember from this bumper sticker that, hey, you can't be any worse than Ted Bundy, because after all, he was a Republican. It's great to have you here tonight at Empower You. I want to introduce you to our virtual team. Betty Overstreet, our great executive director, Jill Google, our operations manager, Bill Roll, our treasurer, our producer, Jay Grunke on the board. Also, our important board members, Joe Platt, Ken Bowman, Karen Cartier, Bill Monier, Nita Thomas, and Barb Horowitz. We're really glad to have the opportunity to learn with you tonight. So 1 week from tonight, April 6th, Empower You Studio will return with live classes. So listen, Governor DeWine is mandating that we ask you to wear masks that night while in the studio. I'm really sorry. I was just hoping that we could leave the decision about mask wearing up to you, you adults. But the governor doesn't quite trust you to make that decision on your own. If you don't feel good about wearing a mask, we'll just see you online next week, no problem. And I hope you understand. We're in the middle of doing some renovations to Empower You Studio to improve it. We're making improvements to the camera system for our online guests, which have become so important over the last year. Who would have ever thought it? We're putting in better lighting, an improved sound system. I hope everything will be ready by next Tuesday. We're sure pushing for it. So, hey, we are a free university. Anything you can do, we want to pass the hat tonight. The easiest way to chip in a couple bucks for us is to just, when you register for a class, throw in a couple bucks on that line on the registration request right there. Or you can go to empoweruohio.org when you're signing up and make a donation. So many of you have. I'm really thankful. Our board's thankful. So listen, many of you who watched our class last Tuesday night when we had Sean Maloney learned about Erin Gentry. We spoke about her Black literature book drive for the Cincinnati Public Schools, and I asked you that night for your help in donating a few books to add to her 600 books she has collected. What a great thing she's done. The night of the class and the next morning, we received $70 and a match for another 70. So we're sending Erin a check for $140. That's great news. More books for kids. Erin just sent me a message. Channel 9 was able to get me a hold of her. And Erin's message to you all was, I really appreciate this so much. Thanks to you. So a quick reality check tonight. I just feel like I've got to put this in perspective for you, because when I heard that the city of Cincinnati was going to get $290 million of stimulus money, I thought to myself, well, how much does what's the budget for the whole city? And I looked, and the whole city budget is $391 million. And I just thought to myself, the government is borrowing money to give the city of Cincinnati almost its entire budget. What a gluttonous amount of money. Why are we doing this? Who is paying for this? Is this really our government? It's just shocking to me. I can't even begin to believe it. This is what happens when you throw money at people in such proportions. You get things like the Hamilton County Commissioners. For those of you who are watching out of state tonight, it's where Cincinnati is, that instead of trying to figure out the best way to spend money, they host a forum where you can just call in and say, I want some money, give it to me. And it's just a different world we're living in. And I just don't understand why in the world we're doing this. So every night when I sit down and watch a little TV, I see this woman's picture rolling across the TV screen. Her name's Jane Timken, and she's running for U.S. Senator to replace Rob Portman. I've got some concerns about her candidacy based on an experience I had with her last February when I reported some corruption to her. I'm not going to take up your time tonight, but if you're interested in what happened when I tried to deal with her a year ago, go to YouTube and search concerns about Jane Timken for Ohio U.S. Senate. And that's if you want some thoughts about her run for the U.S. Senate. I wanted to give you some news about a future speaker that's going to be joining Empower You that I'm just thrilled to have here, Vivek Ramaswamy. He's a local young man from Evendale. He will be joining us May 4th, along with a class on Ken Blackwell on election integrity. Vivek's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, and he's been on the cover of Forbes magazine, where you see him here. And you see him on Tucker Carlson show all the time, and he's now on Shannon Bream show too. He's got a new book out called Woke Inc., and I had a chance to talk to him on the phone about it. I'm just so thrilled that Vivek will join us to discuss his book, and really, he's going to join us to discuss his concern about America on May 4th. What makes this so cool is that Vivek is a St. X graduate, and really he's just a friend of our family going way back. So tonight's required reading, you know, I give you a required reading session at every class. This one was sent to me by an education warrior from Ohio. I hope you're ready for it. This is a wild one. You'll find a link to this article on empoweryouohio.org under tonight's class. So a couple of weeks ago, some of you know I sent out an email calling the Ohio Department of Education radical. A few people unsubscribed, a few people questioned my use of that word radical. Tonight's required reading, I think, is gonna dot the I on whether that was the proper word or not. This is an article that a magazine I'm not familiar with called the City Journal. Bill Bennett, the former education secretary, said it's a must-read magazine. This is an article that was written about the state of Ohio called Smashing Whiteness in the Classroom. It's an insane story about Mike DeWine's Ohio Department of Education. DeWine appoints 8 members of the 19, 11 are elected. The article talks about how last school year, the board promoted a far-left racialist anti-police propaganda called the Anti-Racist Allyship Starter Pack. This was a pack that contained 200 links to anti-racist op-eds, essays, and blog posts, including an article called The Souls of White Folk. This all went up on the Ohio Education Department website. And in that article, it says that America today is a land of superstition and idolatry. It says that the chief idol is a 300-year-old idea called whiteness, and that whiteness is a stone idol in the mind of white people in America that must be smashed into pieces. The Ohio Board of Education recommended that teachers read other articles like White Feminism is White Supremacist Heals, White People Have No Culture, Capitalism is Real Robbery, and the Case for Delegitimizing the Police. Another article that went out to teachers to read was by someone you may have heard mentioned named Ibram X. Kendi, that says teaching students to be colorblind is racist. Okay, these articles have been taken down, but this article is a joke about the state of Ohio. The Ohio Department of Education is unclear who put these articles up on their website, and they want you to know that they prioritize equity and anti-racism for all Ohio students. Hey, listen, Ohio, I just want to tell you, these are our schools. We don't have to stand for this crap. State liberty groups all around Ohio are starting to discuss kind of putting a wall around Ohio and forcing this critical race theory stuff out to stop it. We need to do it fast. It's everywhere. If you're interested in getting involved in this super important issue to stop critical race theory in Ohio, would you consider sending me an email to info@empoweryouohio.org. It's really important. I wanted to give you a quick, since we have got just a little extra time tonight, I wanted to give you a quick preview of a class that's coming up. It's a class that I can't wait to go over with you on April 15th, when I'm going to talk about Winston Churchill as the indispensable man. I've really been researching Churchill's life for the past several months for a class I'll present on April 15th. So I know Betty controls the attendance here at Empower You, but I've told her that any of you that sign up tonight for the class, you get extra credit. So the thesis for this class on April 15th, it's an interesting one. Was Winston Churchill the most important man of the 20th century? We'll also be discussing a decision he made that may be the most important political decision ever made in history. For those of you who don't know a lot about Churchill, here's a quick little kind of preview on some of the things that you may have seen him say. This just goes a couple minutes.
Was a world power when statesmen like Winston Churchill talked.
People do they think we are? To desperate hazards, he attempts the invasion of the British Isles, as well he may.
I encourage you to join us for this unforgettable discussion on the life of the great man, Winston Churchill, on April 15th. Gosh, I love the way he says Nazis. The price of greatness is responsibility. That's quite a line. I hope you can join us. Tonight's giveaway, we've got a real double header to give away tonight. The first giveaway is Jay's book, The Price of Panic. We'll get this right out to you. If you don't win the book tonight, please order the book on Amazon. I know Jay's got another way that might even save you some more money that might be better to order on. He'll tell you about that in a minute. And since we won't be having class Thursday night because of opening day, go Reds. Gosh, what better giveaway tonight to give than a new Reds hat to add to your wardrobe. This one, it's really a cool hat. It's got, I hope you can see this, it's got an American flag sewn in the side. So you have a chance to win tonight, Jay's book or the Reds hat to add to your wardrobe to help the Reds win. And all you have to do is go down to the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, put in your email address. That's where you're going to go to ask questions about Jay's presentation tonight. So just go down to the bottom where it says Q&A, put your email address in, and you'll have a chance to win. For those of you who were with us last Tuesday night, Sean Maloney gave a great class. Sean asked us not to record the class because of changing gun laws. I really hope you got a chance to see it. And congratulations to Greg C., who won the Defender package from Second Call Defense. Tonight's class will be filmed. And to rewatch of a class, it'll be available tomorrow on empoweruohio.org after 4 o'clock. Watch it and share it with your friends. Next Tuesday, when we go to Empower You Studio, it will be the return of Peter Bronson. He will be talking to us about Sin City's Underground and the Beverly Hills Supper Club. Just an incredible story. Don't miss Peter Bronson, he was just a great writer. I don't know what else to say about him. I remember when Peter was at the Enquirer, I'd have questions about, or I wouldn't agree with something he'd write, and I'd jot him a note. and he would always get back to me, and we could banter a little bit about things, and he was just had so many good things to say. If you can't be here Tuesday night for Peter Bronson's class, or if you're going to watch it online, which I hope all of you will do if you don't want to come to the studio, you can just make an online donation at empoweruohio.org for $20. We'll have Peter sign a book for you, and you can pick it up here at Empower You Studio. Then next Thursday night, Janet Heisel from the Enquirer will be here to talk to us about the book Submerged. Was Sarah Widmer's death really a murder at all? This is a Dateline type story. It's fascinating. It's going to be really fun to hear her take on it. I think she covered all 3 trials. And the same applies to her book. If you want to send us $20 on the website, mention what it's for, we'll hold a book for you. Also that night, Nancy Brenneman, who is an accountant, will also join us at the beginning of the session with some last minute tax advice, since the tax season has been added to a little bit. So tonight, Jay Richards, we're so glad to have him tonight to talk to us about the pandemic. Jay is a research assistant professor in the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and the executive editor of The Stream. Richards is an author or editor of more than a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated and Indivisible, The Human Advantage and Money, Greed, and God, winner of the 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award. His newest book, The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. He is also creator and executive producer of several documentaries, including 3 that have appeared widely on PBS. Jay's articles and essays have been published in the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Washington Post, the New York Post, Newsweek, Forbes, Fox News, National Review Online, and others. A bunch. He's written and lectured on a wide range of topics. We're just so glad to have Jay here tonight. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, as Jay talks, he mentioned his presentation will go about 40 minutes. As you have questions and answers, go ahead and go to the Q&A section and ask them. If something's pertinent to what he's talking about, we might break in and ask him, but otherwise we'll take questions at the end. Jay Richards, we're so glad to have you, and I'm going to stop share so that you can get in here, and welcome to Empower You. We're glad to have you here.
No, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Sorry we couldn't be in studio together. I am here in Washington, D.C., but we will make the best of it. And of course, you save a lot of time, as I learned. One of you guys, it may be Jay or it may be you, Dan, that needs to let me share, because it's not letting me share yet. So
try
just
it right.
Give me permission.
Yeah, try it.
Right. Now we got it.
Go ahead and try again.
Yep, now we got it. Well, I want to talk to you for maybe 35 or 40 minutes, and then we want to have time for question and answer. And so if you have questions, you can post those at will whenever you want to, and then Dan's going to go through those and we'll talk about them at the end. In case I forget, let me just tell you, if you don't happen to win the book and you want to buy the book, it's certainly available at Amazon. And I can't tell you what the price is at Amazon because they have dynamic pricing. And so you can check there, but the hardcover is still available there. But you can also get it at Regnery.com. Regnery is the publisher of the book, and they're running a special right now for 50% off the list price. So if you order it at Regnery, and then under the code, you type PANIC50, capitalized PANIC 50, and you get 50% off. And I'm guessing that might be a little cheaper than you would get at Amazon, but just compare it, and you can take your pick, whichever one you want to do. So The Price of Panic was not a project that even 13 months ago I would probably have guessed that I would have gotten involved in. But about this time last year in March, remember, the lockdowns in most places in the country started about a year ago. And there were 3 of us, William Briggs, who is a friend and a professional statistician, Doug Axe, who is a biologist, and I, that were independently very, very worried about what was happening. And it wasn't because we were virus skeptics or didn't think that a deadly virus could spread around the world or that we would need to do anything about it, but that we thought policy and political decisions were being made based upon very, very little evidence, and what we suspected was going to be very bad evidence. And so major decisions that affected the entire country and in many ways the entire world were being made based on very, very little information. And there was a presumption of knowledge that we knew for a fact did not exist. And a lot of it honestly had to do with the fact that we, Briggs and I in particular, had studied predictive computer modeling and other subjects for years and knew the media's naivete about treating this as if it was solid science, when in fact, if you haven't tested a model, all it is an fancy argument that is built into a computer. It's not evidence. A model is only as good as the assumptions you plug into it. If the assumptions match the sort of observational evidence and all your assumptions are right, then the model could tell you some really useful stuff. If it hasn't been tested against the real world, it's just an argument, right? And so saying 3 guys with a computer have developed an argument, that's not very persuasive. But then you're told, oh, well, a computer model has predicted something, and you assume sort of it's murky. If you don't know what a model is, that sounds scary. It sounds very sciencey, and it's enough to buffalo large segments of the population. It's certainly enough to buffalo most of the media. And unfortunately, political leaders who themselves are not necessarily up on these details. And what do you do if somebody shows up in a white lab coat and tells you this is what the science says? And that was what got us worried. We thought, you know, somebody needs to write a book about this. And Doug Axe actually called me and I said, yeah, somebody does. And I hope somebody does it, because I don't want to be involved in a book that would have to be written quickly, because I thought the only reason to write it is to try to get the argument out so that at least maybe we can prevent a rolling barrage of lockdowns. But one thing led to another. We wrote a proposal. We pitched it to Regnery Publishers, which I knew was really the only publisher capable of turning a book around really quickly. And so by April the 1st, we had a book contract and we're writing this book. Turned it in the summer. We adjusted the numbers in the summer, and then it was out in October. So it was kind of breakneck speed. I can tell you though that if you lose your commute, if you don't ever have to go in, if you lose all of your out of town speaking gigs, which you had scheduled, you never have to leave the house. You don't bother to sort of change clothes, you just wear your sweats, right? And you don't shave, you can actually get a lot done. In fact, you can, if you've got a couple of co-authors, actually write a book on this. And so that's how it happened. And we actually think 2020, the real historic story of 2020 is not actually about the virus. The virus is bad, it's not good for you. It's on the order of maybe the Hong Kong flu of 1968 in terms of how dangerous it is, though it distributes its danger much differently than the Hong Kong flu. And so in that panic of virtually the entire world, and a sort of sense of how intense that panic is, you could get from a survey in July. And this was by what's called the COVID tracking poll, asked Americans, now this is way back last July, what percentage of Americans did people think had died from COVID-19? So what percentage of the entire population of the United States did people think had died from COVID-19? Well, the guess was 9%. That was what most people guessed, that on average. So think about that for a minute. So the average American in July thought 9% of their fellow Americans had died from COVID-19 just since March, effectively, right? So over the last few months. Now, what was the number at the time? It was actually that. It was actually 0.06%. So if you do the math, that means the average American thought that COVID-19 was 150 times more deadly than it actually was. This isn't based on predictions, it's based on just the regular CDC numbers, that people thought it's 150 times more deadly. So where would they get that idea? Well, they didn't get that idea by looking at the tables at the CDC. They got this idea from the media. They got it from CNN, the Chiron at the bottom of the screen when they're at the gym, the news feed and the selective stories at Apple News and at Twitter, wherever they were getting their news. That's the only place they could possibly have gotten this impression that the virus was 150 times more deadly than it was. Now that is a disaster, because in any kind of emergency, you want to calibrate the response to the emergency to the genuine danger. If you don't do that, you can over respond so that the response can end up being as deadly or more deadly than the thing that you're responding to. I mean, it's the proverbial, you don't chop off your head to get rid of a headache. The response ends up not being appropriate to the danger. And so this was the problem from the very beginning, is that we were utterly bombarded with what you could just call panic porn, in which the entire design of the media's campaign on this was not to inform us, not to give us an objective view so we could use our own reason, but was to just keep us in a constant state of panic. So what caused this? Well, it's kind of complicated story, but we need to think in terms of a double contagion. There was a viral contagion, the result of this new coronavirus that was different from other coronaviruses that humans have been exposed to. So it was genuinely new in the human population. But there's also the social contagion that followed upon it, right? If you look at we've had other pandemics in the past, even in the recent past. We had the bird flu, we had swine flu, we had the Spanish flu of 1917, we had the Hong Kong flu of 1968, we had the Asian flu in 1957, killed about 2 million people. There was nothing like a global panic, a social contagion in the same way we had in 2020. And there's several things that really cause this. The first is just that it had scary origins. So we know that it emerged in Wuhan, China. That picture there, by the way, is the Wuhan Institute of Virology that we all now know is in China. It's supposedly a very secure research facility for viruses, but the State Department about 3 years ago issued a report saying the security was not good. Now, what's sort of problematic about this? Well, it's not just that it came from China, but it came from the People's Republic of China, which we know tends to lie. It's not an open society. We learned very quickly that the World Health Organization for weeks was actually carrying water for the People's Republic of China. So telling us it probably wasn't anything to worry about. There's no human-to-human transmission. Essentially, we're covering for the Chinese government, which is a major funder of the World Health Organization. So there's that problem. There's also the cover story, which is that it came from a wet market, which always looked to people that were paying attention like a cover story. I think it's exceedingly likely that the virus actually leaked accidentally from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, if you're following local news, you'll notice that the World Health Organization just issued a report. They went to China, they went to Wuhan. If you know anything about they were supposed to study the situation and then come up with a report. But of course, they were tended and they were controlled by the authorities. So there's nothing like a real investigation. So the World Health Organization has issued a report saying it probably wasn't leaked. It probably just came from food or something like that. So if anything, that's more evidence that it probably was a leak. Now, I'm not saying that it was intentionally leaked. What's much more likely is that they're doing research. We know they were dealing with these bats that don't come from Wuhan, but bats in which this type of virus is quite common. We know they were doing gain-of-function research on these viruses, which is a way of sort of testing what would need to happen to this virus to make it transmissible to humans. And it's the purpose of doing this is to develop vaccines ahead of time. And then as things happen, someone ended up carrying it out accidentally. They were infected with the virus, presumably asymptomatic, and they ended up out and it spread from there. We think that's probably what happened. Can't prove it. That's most likely, but that's enough to kind of just be scary. It sounds very much like the 2013 movie Contagion, which was really, really scary, or any sort of viral contagion movie you've ever seen. It's what it sounds like. The second thing is a computer model out of the Imperial College London in the middle of March, which everyone, at least officials, more or less took as gospel about a description of the danger of the virus. So this is the Imperial College London was a team of 30 computer engineers effectively that do this predictive modeling, led by this guy, Neil Ferguson. Now, it was this model that came up with the idea that there would be 2.2 million American deaths unless we implemented drastic lockdowns. If you're wondering where that number came from, this is where it came from. That was based on an assumption that the infection fatality rate of the virus was 3.4%. Now you might be wondering, okay, this is mid-March. Where did they get that number 3.4%? Well, they pretty much had to pull it out of thin air. They used some travel data from China and some things like this, but at the time they had absolutely no reason to assume an infection fatality rate of 3.4%. But assuming that, and then assuming that lockdowns would make a difference, right? And then you have to calculate, okay, how much difference do lockdowns make? Then you can end up with a prediction of your model that 2.2 million Americans will die within a few months unless you lock down. And the lockdown was supposed to solve it. But notice that was all assumptions in the model. This is what led us to think, okay, this is a disaster because computer models are being used to predict things and guide policy, even though we don't know if the model's based on reality. And within, I would say, about a month, so by mid-April, we knew the model was just almost completely worthless. In fact, they kept it closed for a while, spent a month cleaning up the model. We know now it was written in Fortran, which is an old computer language. When they finally opened it up to some computer engineers, I think at Microsoft looked at it, and he said, the computer model is a buggy mess that looks more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a fine-tuned piece of programming. So there was no reason in the world ever to have believed that this model gave us any kind of accurate information. We should not have been using it to make decisions, especially decisions that affect the lives of millions of human beings. But that's what happened. And how did that happen? Why did this not just become an obscure model? Well, it was because Dr. Tedros, who is the Secretary General of the World Health Organization, heard about it and for some reason decided to believe it. Okay, so the World Health Organization is the global health arm of the United Nations. It's been a part of the United Nations since the United Nations was chartered in the 1940s. So it was there from the very beginning. Tedros heard this. He accepted the numbers as true, the 3.4% infection fatality rate. And by the way, even in late April, if you were to Google the infection fatality rate of the coronavirus, it gave you this number. So that is how utterly pervasive this information became, that if you Googled it, it came up as the preferred answer, right? Well, now, who is Tedros? Well, Tedros is a scientist, but he's spent a lot of his career actually as part of the government in his native Ethiopia. He is a member of an ethno-nationalist communist party in Ethiopia. And as a member of that party, when that party was in power, he actually served as a health minister in its government. So let this sink in for a minute, right? So this idea that an ethno-nationalist communist from Ethiopia would be the person in charge of steering global health policy. I mean, this sounds like a conspiracy novel from the 1970s, honestly, and not a real thing. But this happens to be the guy that was in charge. Now, Chinese-American commentator and an analyst, Gordon Chang, he said, Tedros is the second to the last person who should be heading the World Health Organization, precisely because the World Health Organization is contaminated by influence from the People's Republic of China. And so the last thing you want is a communist in charge of the World Health Organization. I said that the last person you would want would be the president of China, Xi Jinping. So basically, you don't want a person like this that's politically allied with the People's Republic of China also running the World Health Organization. And what was funny is that we suspected this early on, and even by, I think it was late April, even the Atlantic magazine admitted the World Health Organization had been carrying water for several crucial weeks for the People's Republic of China, which meant that we had weeks where we didn't actually really know what we were dealing with. So Tedros accepts the computer model, the dire predictions. He tells other public health officials, people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and other people around the world. And then those health officials, what do? Well, they tell the politicians for whom they serve. And that is exactly what happened. So those of you probably remember how this went. So you had Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci. So remember, these are people that when President Trump was president, he inherited as they're a part of the permanent bureaucracy. So Fauci has been working for the federal government for something like 40 years. He inherits these people. They're the public health experts, right? Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a public health expert working for the government, that's not like the gold medal of science. That doesn't mean that you are the smartest person and have the most sage advice. It just means that you happen to work for the government, and so you're going to be the one giving advice to politicians. And so in a press conference in April, Someone asked President Trump why he went along essentially with lockdowns, because he was saying in March, we don't want the cure to be worse than the disease. His instincts were that this was maybe not a great idea, but he ultimately went along. And this is what he said. He said, well, two very smart people came into my office and said, Mr. President, unless we shut everything down, 2.2 million Americans are going to die. That's the number he used, 2.2 million Americans. Now, who are those smart people? Well, we know one of them was Dr. Anthony Fauci. We don't know if the other one was Birx. We could not figure out who the other person was, but let this sink in. Two people representing science can walk in to speak to the President of the United States and tell him, unless you do this, 2.2 million Americans are going to die. And that number was based entirely on a predictive computer model, which we knew very quickly was not based upon the evidence. That's how you get something like this. So it's an extremely narrowed sort of information communication channel. This is what we call the tyranny of experts. The problem is not expertise per se. Obviously, you want the smartest people that know subject the best to be the ones that are talking about this stuff. But in a normal situation, what you'd have if you're dealing with a complex scientific subject is you'd have a bunch of independent scientists hashing it out and arguing about it. But that's not what you have in this case. What you have is government officials speaking on behalf of science who have a particular incentive. They have a strong incentive always to overestimate, always to exaggerate the danger for obvious reasons. Imagine you're advising the president and you say, 100 people will die from this and 1 million people will end up dying. Well, that's a disaster. But if you say 1 million people are going to die unless you shut it down and then only 100 die, you can say either, well, good thing we were, better safe than sorry, or you could say the shutdown saved all those people. So you see how it works? So you're always going to be incentivized to exaggerate. Whereas an independent scientist working at Stanford or Oxford, they don't work for the government, so they don't have an incentive to exaggerate in that way. But this is the problem, is when you have officials speaking in an isolated way for science and speaking to political leaders, is you can end up with this danger of the tyranny of experts. It's also a tyranny because the experts speaking usually aren't the relevant experts. Dr. Anthony Fauci is an immunologist whose expertise is AIDS. Same with Dr. Birx. Well, AIDS is not the kind of disease where you develop herd immunity. So it's actually not relevant to this particular virus and to this type of contagion. And so they didn't really have the kind of expertise that would have been most directly relevant. They certainly didn't have expertise in the political and economic consequences of public health policy. In fact, Fauci showed almost no interest when it came to that. So you can have an expertise in one thing, but you end up as an advisor in some completely different subject, and you gain credibility of expertise from a subject, even though you're not even talking in that subject. This is always the danger. And then, of course, you had the media promotion. If all you had were these advisors and politicians that were feeling like they had to do what they had to say, but there was just one of 20 advisors, well, then you're a president, you weigh the advice of different people and different experts against each other, and then you make a decision that you try to make a prudent judgment. But in the case at hand, what happened is that these particular experts were elevated by the media so that they became these infallible oracles of science. Right? So the fact that you know Anthony Fauci's name is evidence of this. The fact that he is on every magazine cover and on every Sunday TV program, that shows you the function of the media in elevating individuals like this. So that within literally days, Anthony Fauci came to represent science, and in particular, epidemiology and infectious disease and all that kind of thing. So even if an equally or more credentialed scientist someplace else said, he's wrong, the media, social media giants treated those people as if they were weird outsiders and cranks and fringe characters that would have their social media accounts dropped, because the official scientists were now speaking, and the media played a crucial role in elevating these people to infallible oracles. Even if the people like Fauci in particular said the opposite thing from week to week, they might be changing what they're actually saying. Whatever the most recent thing he said was always just the considered scientific view, and there could be no contradiction to it. Without the media doing that, we think we would have had some problems, but we would not have ended up in this kind of catastrophe where you had a president and presidents and prime ministers elsewhere in this awkward position of having to, on the one hand, they needed to make a rational decision, but if they did anything to disagree with these official scientists, they would be attacked and demonized as denying the science. Well, no, maybe like Ron DeSantis, they just got some scientists from Europe and asked their advice and then decided to do that rather than what the official scientists said. That's a rational thing to do, but of course the media portrayed that as a denial of science. And so you had the media promotion, and then finally you had the overlay of social media. So not just CNN and NPR and the New York Times, but social media. This was the first time we of course had a pandemic in 2009, but social media and smartphones had not fully penetrated the population. So it wasn't until 2020 that we had both a pandemic and then everyone with direct real-time access to high definition video on their body. So as a result of that, an old man could fall over and die on a street somewhere in China. Someone would happen to have video of it, post it to Instagram, and within a couple of hours, 1 billion people have seen it on social media and on the news, and assume that that's what this virus does. It causes people to just drop over and die, right? Well, it took months for that image to get out of people's minds, even though it had probably had nothing whatsoever to do with the coronavirus. This is why a former health minister in Israel said that this was the first virus with public relations. It had constant social media boosting, and it was always and everywhere designed to terrify us. All right, so this is the conditions that get set up that you can end up with a vast planet-wide social contagion based on very little information and the sort of not well-founded opinions of computer modelers and a few well-placed public health officials. That's how it happens. So that's the kind of depressing part of the story, obviously. And it certainly has led to panic. Now, when we were working on this book, we knew it was going to come out in October. We thought it will be an after-action report because by July, people will figure out that, okay, the virus is certainly dangerous. We knew it could be very dangerous for people, especially so-called people that had so-called comorbidities. So if you're over 70, you're vitamin D deficient, you are obese, and you have type 2 diabetes, right? You're at very high risk. And in fact, we know the vitamin D deficiency now is actually a major predictor of problems for that. On the other hand, if you're 18 years old and you're healthy, you're more at risk from the ordinary flu in terms of dying than you would be from COVID-19. So we knew that. So we thought by July, people will have figured this out. And we'll be talking, okay, how did we manage to get so terrified? We were staggered that in October, we were talking about second lockdowns. And I can tell you in my neighborhood in suburban Washington, D.C., people still walk around outside with their masks on, absolutely terrified. And it's March, it's almost April of 2021. And so for a long time, a good solid half of the population has managed to maintain a state of near panic, no matter what the data, no matter what the details. And they could actually solve their own problem. They could actually be less worried if they would literally go to the CDC website, but they don't even do that. They get all of their information from media transmitters. It's the word media means between, right? And so the information is mediated by these agents, and this creates this kind of constant state of panic. All right, so now let's talk about the policies and what exactly happened and whether they did anything and what the cost was. Well, you probably remember at the very beginning, the initial justification for the lockdowns was to flatten the curve. We were told, okay, it's not possible to control the spread of a virus, strictly speaking. Nevertheless, because this is a new virus, there's a danger that we'll end up with excess deaths because so many people will catch it that they will bombard the healthcare system all at once. And so a lot of people that could be treated would end up being triaged and they would die unnecessarily simply because they couldn't get treated. And so the idea was that, now we were not going to prevent the total number of cases from occurring. That's not something that's possible. We will just spread it out. Right. And so this is the famous image. This is modeled on, I think, the Vox magazine image that President Obama tweeted, and it went very, very viral. This was the basic image. And so you notice that without protective measures, in other words, protective measures is mainly lockdowns, is what those were. You end up with the cases and they spike and they go way above the healthcare system capacity. This idea, we have this fixed capacity. You get too many people, bombards the system, that's a problem. And so what you do is protective measures. The idea is that it would spread out the number of cases far enough out that hopefully the healthcare system could handle it. Now notice, if you remember your high school geometry, there's the same area under both curves. So the same amount of space under the red and under the blue. In other words, it's exactly the same number. And that was the assumption right at the beginning, is that you're not going to be able to stop people from getting it. You can just maybe slow down the rate at which they get it. So that's why we sent hospitals, naval hospitals, and docked them off of Manhattan. And the Javits Center was outfitted with all these extra beds, hospital beds, which none of which were used. It was based upon this assumption. And there were some places where the healthcare system did get pressured, in particular in places like Connecticut and New Jersey and New York, which were really the kind of hot spots. But remember, the assumption was that you can't stop people from ultimately getting it. You're just going to slow it down maybe by a couple of weeks. And so that was the idea of 15 days to slow the spread or to flatten the curve or something like that. So that was the initial justification for the lockdowns. But we knew within 2 weeks, okay, the healthcare system is, it's under pressure in some places, but it's handling it. And so the lockdown should have ended at that point, but they didn't. In fact, they just kept going. And then basically we were told now the lockdowns actually are to prevent people from getting the virus. But at the beginning, we were already told, and this is what everyone in epidemiology knew, you can't do that. There's no evidence that you can do that with lockdowns. The hope was just that by doing this, we'd maybe slow it down a little bit at the beginning. And so the assumption about what lockdowns could even do changed from the very beginning. And so we ended up months later, still in some state of lockdown in most states. So what was the prior evidence for lockdowns, right? People assume that lockdowns, in which you lock down the whole population, that maybe this is some well-known method for preventing the spread of respiratory viruses. So what was the prior evidence for lockdowns? How did we know that this would work? We did not know that it would work. And in fact, this method was a new and untried method that got popular in the 2000s, worked its way through the public health communities around the world, based again on computer models that assumed it would work, in which you just lock down entire populations, unlike the standard response before, which was quarantining. So quarantining is how humans have dealt with these sorts of things for hundreds of years, where you take known infected people that are spreading it and you isolate them. You usually isolate them together because they're not at risk for each other, and you isolate them from the rest of the population, and then you maybe put special protection on the parts of the population that are really, really at risk, right? So that would have been the normal thing to do, for which we have a lot of evidence: quarantine the sick and put in protective measures for the people that are at high risk, especially the elderly in nursing homes. That's not what we did. We did population-wide lockdowns. Now, here's what's really frustrating about this, is that in October of 2019, so basically 6 months before this happened, the World Health Organization issued a report. They were focusing on the flu to say, okay, what responses help to prevent the spread of the flu? It's called Non-Pharmaceutical Public Health Measures for Mitigating the Risk and Impact of Epidemic and Pandemic Influenza. All right, so it's a mouthful. Well, this studied, guess what it studied? Things like closing schools, locking down healthy populations, having the general public wear masks. And this is a meta study where they studied basically all the peer-reviewed literature to see what the evidence was that these things could help prevent, say, a flu pandemic. And you know what they said? In every case, very little or no evidence that these would have made any difference. So the World Health Organization was saying in October of 2019, lockdowns probably won't make a difference. And in March and April, they were advocating the very lockdowns that they themselves reported there was no evidence for. And maybe you could say, well, it was just because they thought, okay, there's no evidence for it, but maybe it'll help. But at the very least, that was the standard of the science at the time, was that there was no evidence that lockdowns would make very much difference. All right, so that's very, very kind of depressing, but we thought, well, maybe they did work anyway. And so this is what we set out to do in the book, and at least to do a kind of preliminary analysis of whether the lockdowns work. Now, it's really hard statistically to separate the signal and the noise when you're doing these things, because you could say, well, we look at one country and they had lockdowns and people did really well, and you have another country and they didn't have lockdowns and people didn't do well. But there's so many confounding variables that it's actually really hard to isolate. So if you want to say lockdowns work, then you can always say, well, yeah, this country had lockdowns and still a lot of people got sick and died, but it would have been worse if they hadn't had a lockdown, right? And so you don't have that counterfactual parallel universe where you can compare the UK with the lockdowns and without the lockdowns. But the problem is that you want some way to test the theory, right? And so the best way to test the theory and to say if the lockdowns work would just be to say, basically, you just look at the case curves of all the countries and all the states that had lockdowns and didn't have lockdowns, and map those with the dates when the lockdowns happened, and then look and see if there is a signature in the signal. Effectively, you think of those case curves, you remember they kind of curve up like this exponentially and then they level off. What you would expect if lockdowns made a difference is that you'd see a telltale signature about 10 days out from the lockdown. So you got to have a lockdown, and then remember, because it takes a while, the virus can still spread, and then people have to get sick and they have to go get tested. And so the long and the short of it is you'd expect the curves to start bending down about 10 days after the lockdowns, if the lockdowns made a difference. All right. So let's take one test case, which is the United Kingdom, which is this is a really depressing story, especially because we watched that cool premiere of Winston Churchill and the kind of inspiring bravery in the face of Nazi Germany that he and the United Kingdom exhibited. And yet it has been planet lockdown there for months. Now, Boris Johnson started out saying, okay, we're not going to be able to outrun this. And then he got sick, and then he decided to go all in on very draconian lockdowns. So this is we've kind of simplified the graph. So if you're interested in the numbers, we've got all of this in the book, all the graphs, all the details. So I'm simplifying this so you can sort of just follow it in a short talk. This is the copy of the UK curve, right? So this is the cumulative cases at the time. So notice, you've got, this is from the beginning, 20 days out, 40 days out. And so the lock is the symbol of when the government lockdown was imposed. And then you've got 10 days out. All right. So as you can see, just have a look at this graph. There is no signature, right? If you didn't know when the lockdown happened, you wouldn't be able to guess from the curve, right? There's just no signature at all in the case curve. It's just there's a lockdown and it keeps going. And then 10 days out, it continues to go. And then it sort of starts slowly spreading down. There's just no sense at all. And the reason this is a good example is because as we show it, that the UK started with a generally open policy where they weren't doing lockdowns. And then they turned around 180 degrees and started really draconian lockdowns. And so if lockdowns were going to make any difference anywhere, it would have made a difference here, and you'd be able to see that. You can do the exact same thing, which you do in the book with all the states. So we did all the states that locked down, mapped them to the dates in which the lockdowns happened, and the ones that didn't. And again, I'll just give you one example of this. This is Georgia. So these are curves, and it's kind of complicated. These are logarithmic, but you can see here at the beginning, okay, when we're going, you see it's going up. You see where the lockdowns happened, right? So don't worry much about the numbers here. You just look at the pattern. The nice thing about Georgia is that they locked down at a particular date fairly early, but then they also opened up fairly early. And you can remember all the news media told us that the Georgia was going to be a catastrophe. It was going to be a death zone because they opened up early. Well, have a look at it. So you can see where the lockdown happened. That's where the lock is. 10 days out, nothing, right? It's just going up and down. There's no sense that anything is, it's doing anything. And then you get the ending of the lockdowns, and 10 days out, you would expect a spike if the opening things up was going to make any difference. It makes no difference. This was the story over and over again in state after state after state. In fact, if anything, the states that did draconian lockdowns tended to do worse than those that didn't. Now, we're not saying that the lockdowns necessarily made it worse, because it may be the fact that maybe some of the states that had it worse at the beginning were inspired to lock down or something like that. The main thing we think we've shown is that there is no evidence that lockdowns made any difference. Any difference. So in other words, what we were find that actually there's no evidence that lockdowns make a darn bit of difference, but that's what we found, alas. So just another example from the book. So this is a histogram of deaths per million for countries with at least 1 million people. So the black bars are the country represent countries that did not lock down, and the light gray are countries that did lock down. So you can look along the x-axis, those are deaths per million. And so if the lockdowns made a difference, what you would expect is the low deaths per million, all the kind of light gray bars, you expect all of them to cluster over on the left side, and you expect all the black bars to cluster over on the right side. You don't see that at all. There's either no pattern, or if anything, the no lockdown countries generally did better. So there's just no evidence that these lockdowns did this. So just in case you're missing the forest for the trees, the World Health Organization said there was no evidence that lockdowns would make a difference in October of 2019. We did the lockdowns anyway, gave us massive data sets. So now we can look and see, did the lockdowns make a difference? Answer, no, they didn't. So there is no reason to think that government imposed lockdowns over and above ordinary voluntary actions that people take would make any significant difference. So then the question is, what that means is that the panic, the public response, ends up being all pain and no gain. And the question is, what is that pain? What was the price of the panic? Not the price of the bugs, the bug itself. We have to calculate, and we do this in the book, we calculate, okay, how much would the pandemic by itself have cost the economy in dollars and lives and well-being? And we have to subtract that from the cost of the panic itself. And it turns out it was incredibly costly. So it's just at the global level, extreme global poverty and starvation. If you think about it, it's from 1990 until 2020, about 1 billion people emerged from absolute poverty in the developed world. The UN Food Program estimates that something like 400 million of those people went back into absolute poverty in 2020, just as a result of the shock to the global food supply chain. So that shows you, if you think about it, there's always somebody, if you rank all the global population in terms of poverty and wealth, the people at the bottom, there's always going to be people right on the edge. And so anything that is a shock to the economic well-being is going to be damaging to them. And as a result, the UN Food Program estimates that it's possible that something like 300,000 people per day by the end of the year, end of 2020, were dying of starvation. That is 300,000 people that would not otherwise have been dying of starvation as a result of the lockdowns. So let that sink in, 300,000 a day. And that's just the kind of global details. In terms of the US economy, we estimated probably the lockdowns per month cost the economy about $1 trillion. So that's $1 trillion. And of course, it's not the dollars that matter. It's those dollars represent people's well-being, their medical bills, paying for their kids' college, paying the rent, paying the mortgage, $1 trillion removed from the economy every single month that the lockdowns continued. So what that means is if you assume the lockdown sort of lessened in the summer, it still cost upwards of $4 trillion there for a few months of lockdown. And of course, by May, we all saw this, over 40 million new jobless claims. Now, a good bit of that has returned, but millions of people are doing different things, and they're now underemployed, or they were in family businesses and now they're working just whatever jobs they can find. So that's part of, that's an artifact of that $1 trillion a month cost. Deaths of despair. So this is deaths from drug and alcohol overdoses and from suicide. These are called so-called deaths of despair. So as most of you probably know, the deaths of despair have been going up a lot in the United States, in particular, accidental drug overdoses from opioids. In fact, this is primarily responsible for the first time in American history, the average life expectancy of white males has actually gone down for the last few years, almost entirely a result of so many people dying of of opioid overdoses. Well, one study actually early on, it was in the summer, estimates that there were probably 75,000 excess deaths of despair in 2020 as a result of lockdown. So that's 75,000 more than would otherwise have been expected. Right? So just think about that. That's just from drug and alcohol overdose, and just in 2020, and suicide. And we collected story after story after story of childhood suicides. There was a sixth grade kid here in suburbs of DC and Virginia that shot himself over a class Zoom actually a few months ago as an example of this. But we didn't know, okay, these are anecdotal, but we're quite certain that 75,000 excess deaths of despair is probably an undercount. Missed cancer screenings and disease screenings. So you remember, because of lockdowns, almost anything other than COVID related things or emergency rooms stopped. So if you had an elective surgery, an elective procedure, which just means it was on the schedule, those got canceled in most places around the country. One study estimates that just in the first 3 months, there were probably about 80,000 missed cancer screenings as a result of these lockdowns. So that's just in April, May, and June, right? 80,000 missed cancer screenings. So people that would otherwise gone to the doctor, had a checkup, their cancer would have been caught early. As a result, the cancer was caught late, and some percentage of those people either will, of course, will feel much greater suffering, but many of them will die that would not otherwise have died. And that's just cancer. So you can see that if then you add heart disease, add diabetes, add all the other things that kill us, and you very quickly could end up with extra deaths from delays in treatment and diagnosis that equal all attributed COVID-19 deaths. Notice I'm not even talking about the complications with the way in which COVID deaths are attributed. I'm just saying, just assume the numbers are accurate. Still, the response ends up being catastrophic. And as you can see, remember, the temptation is to say, well, yeah, but think how much worse it would have been without the lockdowns. But sorry, there's no evidence the lockdowns made any difference. And then, of course, the miscellany of costs from drugs, increase in drug use that doesn't show up statistically, millions of children, especially lower income children, who miss in many ways an entire year now of school and are now a year behind. All the missed opportunities for worship, the infringements upon religious freedom, where people can't go to church, they can't go to mass. Now in many places, I have a friend who's Methodist who said for a year there's not been one Methodist in-person service in Washington, D.C., and there will not be yet again at Easter. And then just the general anxiety and depression that doesn't necessarily show up on statistics, but lives with people for a long time. The costs were absolutely immense. And these, again, to emphasize, are the costs of the response, of the panic, not the cost of the virus itself. And then, of course, the biggie, the one that we actually think maybe makes the most difference long-term for the largest number of people, which is the loss of freedom. Most of us were not prepared for an assault on political and economic and religious freedom from public health bureaucracies. But if you think about it, the public health argument is much more compelling to most people than other arguments. If we were told, okay, you're not allowed to go to work, you're not allowed to go to church because it's bad for you, and you might harm yourself if you go out of the house because you might have a wreck. So you have to stay home. Don't send your kids to school. You got to not work, and you're not allowed to go to church. Well, right, most of us would have resisted immediately. We would have been absolutely apoplectic. The right would have been talking about the First Amendment. The left would have been talking about fascism. We would overwhelmingly have opposed that. Now, change the argument slightly. What if you're told instead, you can't send your kids to school, you can't go to work, and you can't go to church because you might catch this deadly virus that is extremely deadly, and you might carry it asymptomatically so that you feel perfectly fine, but nevertheless you're carrying it and you're infectious. And so you go to church, you're fine, but you sneeze and the old man in front of you catches it and you kill him. Right? Now that's a moral jujitsu in which we're told you have to give up your freedoms that you're accustomed to for the benefit of others, right? For the common good. That's a very powerful argument, and we were not prepared for that. Most of us were not prepared for it. That's why people can shame you on the street if you're not wearing a mask. The idea is that you're putting other people at risk. The problem is not that you're putting yourself at risk, you're putting other people at risk. Well, that's the danger. Well, we now know the asymptomatic spread story probably wasn't true. Asymptomatic spread is probably not significant. And in any case, the lockdowns we know didn't make any difference. And there's very little evidence, incidentally, that this kind of casual mask wearing makes any difference. And so as a result, there's this massive cost in freedom, not just in the United States, but around the world, and especially in the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere has gone completely overboard. So the UK, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Victoria, the province of Victoria in Australia is just an absolute police state. I've done a lot of media down there because they've just utterly and continuously locked down. This is a cost that we need to take seriously. And there's a question of how exactly we get this back. How, having conceded to the authorities this power to tell us not to go to work, that some public health official and immunologist could tell you not to go to work and you would do it and your employer would agree to it. How do you regain that? It's not obvious. And I think at the moment, this is an open question. But I do think I don't want to end with that kind of depressing note, because I do think that there are signs of resistance, signs that some people are willing to fight against this so-called brave new normal. We don't want the new normal, and we don't want to hear that. And in fact, we need to start calling it the brave new normal, this idea that it's normal for public health officials to be able to tell us we can't go to work, we can't go to school, we can't go to church, and we can't walk outside without covering our face. This will continue until a critical mass of the population decides enough. We don't have to, I'm not saying we should be violent. I'm saying that at some point we have to simply quit complying. These are impossible orders to maintain if a large enough segment of the population simply refuses to do it. Notice in Europe, Europe is having massive, massive protests against this. But for some reason in the United States, enough of us are still cowed that we're not doing that. Notice you don't see big anti-lockdown protests and rallies and things like that. But there was a hopeful sign already last summer. This is a picture of the Los Angeles skyline in July 4th of 2020. Some of you may remember Mayor Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, told Los Angeleans that there would be no fireworks sold in the city and there would be no public fireworks display anywhere in Los Angeles. Well, some of you may have seen this amazing drone footage of the skyline of Los Angeles on July 4th, but millions of Los Angeleans decided they weren't necessarily going to follow the mayor's orders. This is basically a time-lapsed shot of the skyline over a period of 30 minutes. These are all private fireworks. And so certainly lots and lots and lots of ordinary people on July 4th decided, no, sorry, we're not going to not have a fireworks display and not have a July 4th celebration. I think we need more of that spirit. It's not a violent spirit. It's not an angry spirit, but it is a spirit of defiance and a willingness to take back something that has been illegitimately taken from us, which is our basic liberties of association, our freedom of association, our freedom, our political freedom, our economic freedom, and our religious freedom. And I don't think, because of the fact that so many politicians have, have gone all in on the lockdowns, gone all in on the masks, gone all in on these things, there's no incentive now for most politicians to go back, right? Because imagine if for 9 months you've been advocating lockdowns. It's now quite obvious that they don't make any difference. And now you're suddenly going to say, okay, people can still get the virus. Some people will die probably of the virus, but we're not going to have lockdowns because those were a bad idea. In an electoral democracy, you don't want to ever do that as a politician, right? You don't want to ever admit that you did something wrong. And so that's why what we have is politicians having both said that these were a good idea, not wanting to admit it, and also, frankly, tasted the power of being able to do this and to get populations to comply, do not want to give this up. In fact, there were discussion among policymakers early last March because these draconian lockdowns were happening in China. And a lot of American politicians and officials said, look, the American people would never tolerate this. And so it really was in some ways an experiment. The media was quite compliant and complicit, though, in terrifying us. And it turns out it worked. It turns out that if we were terrified enough, not for ourselves necessarily, but yes, partially afraid for ourselves, but also afraid for our fellow Americans, that we would be willing to abandon the freedoms that we supposedly held dear and that we took for granted. And so now what this means is that every emergency that will ever happen again, right? Everyone will know that Americans were perfectly willing to comply as long as it was a public health emergency. So what that means is that officials and elected politicians are going to have a very strong incentive always to justify their increases of power in terms of the public health and the common good. And so we're going to have to take that into account, I think, and that's going to be probably the most important lesson that we're going to have to learn from the pandemic of 2020. And with that, I will end and happy to take questions. We can stay until 8:30 if there are questions. I'm happy to discuss that. I'm going to hand that over actually to Dan and let him read the questions.
And I see your email address there, Jay. Thank you very much. So
Yep.
a friend sent this book to me at Christmas time. It's by Henry David Thoreau, and it's called Civil Disobedience. Is that kind of at the end of your talk, what you're recommending that people are going to have to at some point stand up and do?
Absolutely. And I think that it can be as simple as, for instance, whatever the edge is. So I'm not obviously advocating violence. We don't need anything like that. All we need is a simple mass refusal to comply with ridiculous orders. It might start with extreme social distancing, where we can't gather in homes or in parks or play sports in parks. It might be not wearing masks when it's obviously just theater, which is what most of this stuff is. It might be, as in some cases, the bar owner in New Jersey and the gym owner in New Jersey, right? The problem is these were one-offs. And so these were brave individuals that isolated themselves. Now, what would happen if every bar in that city in New Jersey decided to stay open, right? It's completely unenforceable. If every gym stayed open, it's unenforceable. And so these kinds of things, these population-wide lockdowns, are only enforceable if we go along. So we don't need to exercise violence. We just need to exercise the freedom that we were using 13 months ago. And then the whole thing falls apart at that point. I really don't think that there are very many American politicians that are going to actually try to arrest people because they're not wearing masks on the street or whatever at this point, whatever ridiculous guideline it is. And so, but what it requires is so small scale local organizing in which lots of people decide to quit complying all at once. As long as it's one gym owner, one bar owner, they're going to get isolated and they're going to get picked off and they're going to get fined $20,000. When a large group of people decide to do it, that changes everything.
So Bill, someone who's watching tonight said, in the future, do you think governments are likely to follow the same similar lockdown measures, or will they be more reluctant to do so?
I think that depends entirely upon what we do. There have been some heroes here. I think Governor DeSantis was head and shoulders above everyone else. So what did he do? Well, he at the time, first of all, he's got an elderly population in Florida. There's lots of retirement communities down there. But he thought, okay, who's going to know more about this virus? Some random public health official in Washington, D.C., or maybe the scientists dealing with it in Europe. And so he actually contacted scientists in Europe and said, okay, what do we know about who's at risk? How dangerous is the virus? What's the infection fatality rate? And very quickly figured out, okay, it's really not that dangerous for younger, healthy populations, and it's quite dangerous for elderly and infirm populations. And so what he did is he opened up the state very quickly because he wanted to destroy the economy and people's lives. And then he added special protection to nursing home and retirement facilities. And so he did the perfect thing. And remember, he was utterly demonized as a mass murderer for months. But that takes a kind of a spine and intestinal fortitude that most people just don't have. He had it. And what we need is more of that kind of bravery. And unfortunately, there's just not that much of that. And so what we're really going to need is, I think, bravery and intestinal fortitude on the part of the American public, including a willingness to be attacked. That's the thing most of us don't want to do. We're fine kind of going along but we're not really fine being accused of being a murderer because we're not going to wear a mask. We're going to have to steel ourselves for that.
Jake, would you spell the name of the publisher that you mentioned? Because there are a couple people
Absolutely.
that want to know how to get the book. Could you spell that for us, please?
Yes, it's Regnery, and so it's Regnery. And in fact, and so if you do Price of Panic Regnery at Google, then there's an actual book page for the Price of Panic at the publisher, and it will come up, and then you can go there and you can order it right there and type in the code.
So being where you're at, Jay, having lived very close to where you're at the university for many years, was there a lot of pressure on you not to put out a book that had this message?
Well, I was expecting that, but in many ways, because everyone was locked down, it just sort of happened. I was afraid there was going to be sort of fear. I have not suffered anything. I honestly did wonder that. I thought, okay, are people going to be upset with me? Is my employer going to be upset? I actually haven't encountered that. I do think that Amazon seemed to they didn't ban the book, but they sort of buried it. So when you did a search, it was hard to find. But none of us,
I know that from personal experience, they can do that, can't they?
They sure can. I mean, yeah, they don't have to pull the book. What they do is they just make it hard to search, or they bury it, or they don't let you advertise, or they don't show you, oh, here's a book that you might like. And so they have ways of doing this without literally pulling it like they did with Ryan Anderson's book. And so we had a little of that, but the first print run actually sold out within just a few weeks, actually, and the publisher had to go back and reprint. So the nice thing is, of course, there are digital copies and there's audio copies too.
Scott wants to ask the question, in your opinion, can employers, colleges, and such require employees and students to be vaccinated?
I don't think so, but I mean, I think that it's going to require lawsuits probably, because what can't happen, it would be very hard for the federal government to mandate. Just the president himself doesn't have that kind of discretion. Mayors and governors do have certain kind of police state protections, especially essentially for emergency powers in case there's a tsunami or something like that. But it's usually just for 30 days. And so legally, it's going to be very hard for government officials to require everyone to get a vaccine. But what's going to happen, and what is happening, is that you're going to get airlines, you're going to get restaurants and employers. They're going to do everything they can to do that. And so it's going to require what we did not do a year ago, which is immediately taking this to the court. And so here's the basic incoherence of the argument for a mandated vaccine. So I'm going to call these treatments vaccines, even though they're not traditional vaccines. They're these mRNA treatments, right? But the FDA and the CDC authorization to use these, they've not been approved. They have been authorized for emergency use, not for conferring immunity. In fact, the CDC guidelines say that explicitly. These vaccines, these serums do not, so far as we know, there's no evidence they confer immunity. They will reduce the severity of symptoms if you get it. But why would they mandate? So the whole point of mandating a vaccine is to say, well, we want to speed up herd immunity so that you can't spread it to someone else. But we're being told officially that you can still spread it even if you've had the vaccine, which means the only reason to get it would be to basically reduce the susceptibility that you have to symptoms. It doesn't confer immunity like a normal vaccine, or at least there's no evidence that it does. And so they don't even have a coherent argument for why they could mandate it. But vaccines, especially if people have religious objections, that would be very hard to maintain, but it's going to probably require some court cases. And so I honestly think right now is the moment in which politicians are trying to decide how much are we going to push this. And if they sense that there's going to be massive uproar, it doesn't have to be the whole population. If 5% of the population is apoplectic if they're made to get this vaccine, politicians will let off. But so far, what we've taught them is that we're perfectly willing to comply, and we'll grumble on Twitter or whatever, but we'll still go along. And that's, I think, what we're going to have to deal with.
A few other questions, got a lot of them coming in. Dan says, thanks, Jay, you rock. Any thoughts on why Israeli cases are going up after the mass vaccination there?
No, it's really hard to tell because there are some variants floating around. And so at the moment, Israel is a weird kind of case, but of course there's very high population density and it has an old population. It's possible that there's a variant right there. And so I have met with some scientists, including Dr. Newt Witkowski, who's one of these scientists that he was pulled off of YouTube last year for speaking out against the lockdowns. And so he thinks we're actually encouraging, the lockdowns are encouraging the replication of variants. And so you create these islands of people, right, that are sort of isolated temporarily because you can't, say, travel into and out of a country. And so it gives the opportunity for a mutation to happen in that one place, and it basically creates, it's like, you know, a literal island in which you could get a biological variation that you wouldn't have somewhere else. He thinks the lockdowns may actually be increasing the number of variants, so that may be what we're dealing with in Israel. And so at the moment, I don't want to speculate on these because it's not like the variants have all been sequenced, but it could be something like that. The other thing is that there's a mess with the numbers, unfortunately, especially because flu, for instance, globally has just completely disappeared. There seems to be some kind of weird dynamic in which in the population, there can't be more than one major respiratory virus at once. And so what the coronavirus did is it sort of crowded out the space where you'd normally get the flu. And so the numbers are strange. So I really don't know. If I had to guess, I would guess that it's some kind of weird variant that Israelis are being exposed to, and they're not, and they haven't, I mean, the serums are not supposed to confer immunity, but at the very least, they're supposed to reduce symptoms. And so I'm assuming that something like that.
Here's a question, a personal question. I don't know if I should even ask it, but one of our attendees wants to know, have you been vaccinated?
No, and I'm not planning to, actually. And so I have a complicated set of reasons for that. But the first is that I had COVID-19 in November, actually had it, was symptomatic, not catastrophic, but it was like a cold that lingered. And so there is no reason for me to get the virus. Even if I got it again, I could deal with it. I'm healthy. And so it was fine. So there's no reason in the world for me to get the vaccine. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think the best that can be said is that these are experimental treatments and that we don't really fully understand the long-term effects of these particular gene therapies. This mRNA, Moderna has been trying to get one of these, something like this, approved by the FDA for 10 years for its entire existence. They got this emergency situation, which is a dream come true for them. And we just really don't know. And so I consider the vaccines to be an unknown risk. And so if you're comparing, okay, I consider myself low risk, especially since I've had it, compare the low risk to an unknown risk, and I'm going to take the low risk. So it's simply kind of cost benefit. Now, if I was really at high risk and worried about it, I might make a different calculation, but that's my calculation. And then honestly, I feel strongly about the association of these vaccines. I want to create an incentive where drug companies will quit using cell lines from aborted stem cells or cell lines, and they could perfectly well go and get others cell lines, but not enough of us have protested. So for both moral and basically prudential reasons, I'm not going to get one of these. If you get a regular vaccine that pops up, yeah, I will plan to do that.
So in response to Dan's question about Israel, Jennifer wrote a response, Immune Escape by Dr. Gert Vanden Bosch. I don't know if you know that.
I do.
But that apparently explains the increase in mutations in vaccine people. So many questions about this vaccine passport. Most people are just concerned about forced compliance further down the line with really every parts of our lives. Is that kind of your take on the whole thing?
Absolutely. I think that we have got to draw a line in the sand with this idea of a vaccine passport, because it is absolutely the camel's nose under the tent. It's exactly what they're doing in China. I mean, this is literally from the playbook of the People's Republic of China and of Beijing. So the question is whether it's just going to be 1.2 billion Chinese that are going to be subjected to this, or the rest of us. And it's this idea of a vaccine passport that I think is where we're absolutely going to have to draw the line.
Thank you. You know, Jay, looking at your presentation, what was so crystal clear to me was the two graphs you showed us of the lockdowns. And if this happens again, we all need to print those up and just hold them above our heads while we protest, because it's just amazing what has happened to us over the last year. And I want to thank you tonight so much for just enlightening us further on Empower You. And I will make sure that the link for tonight's presentation where you can buy that book is placed under the class right away and get that up there. So Jay Richards, thank you so much for joining Empower You. Enjoy your night tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. My pleasure to be with you.
Well, that was really an interesting presentation, and there's so many different ways we could have gone to it. And I'm sorry for a few of you that we weren't able to get to a few of your questions. I do want to just end the presentation tonight. I've got a Empowered Citizen Award. I want to just kind of a fun one that was news to me when I saw it. So tonight we have an Empowered Citizen Award. This one will probably be a little bit of a surprise to you, but I don't know. I just saw this somewhere that Clint Eastwood is going to turn 91 on May 31st. Where has time gone? What a life he has lived. I wanted to remind you he achieved success with Western TV series such as Rawhide in the 50s and 60s. And who could forget his role as Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry in the 70s and 80s? During that time, he won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Forgiven. He won 4 Golden Globe Awards. He starred in fun movies like Any Which Way You Can, Escape from Alcatraz, and Heartbreak Ridge. He directed tons of films, Mystic River, American Sniper. My favorite Clint Eastwood movie, I think, of all time, I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It's called Play Misty for Me. Have you seen it? I don't know if you've seen this image before, but it's really all over, and it's kind of curious. In the picture, Eastwood says, I have a very strict gun control policy. If there's a gun around, I want to be in control of it. Well, surprisingly, in 75, Eastwood told People magazine that he favored gun control of some type. Eastwood took a real interest in politics and public policy, really in the world. He was mayor of Carmel in 1986 and 2001. He served in the California State Park and Recreation Commission. He endorsed Mitt Romney. During a screening of Unforgiven, he, at the Cannes Film Festival, decried what he saw as political correctness, what we're going through now. He said, a lot of people thought Dirty Harry was politically incorrect, but I thought he was interesting and daring. Many of you might remember he endorsed Mitt Romney in 2012, and he delivered a primetime address at the 2012 Republican National Convention, where he delivered a speech to an empty chair that represented Barack Obama. He was a registered libertarian and said he was a fiscal conservative and a social liberal before it was fashionable. More than anything, you may remember Clint Eastwood from this clip.
Go ahead, make my day.
Wow, that really takes me back there. This is Eastwood with Sandra Locke in 1975 at the filming of The Outlaw Josie Wales. They dated for 13 years and starred in 6 films. She was really the love of his life. We should all enjoy this guy while he's alive, as he sure has made a lot of people's days and contributed a lot in everything that he's really ever participated in, whether the movies or his life or his common sense advice. Clint Eastwood, you are an empowered citizen. And hey, how about a few more movies? So I want to announce our winners of our great giveaway tonight. And I'm pleased to say that Rose P is the winner of the Jay Richards book. Congratulations out there, Rose. I hope you're with us. And Carl, you are the winner of the Reds baseball hat. So hopefully I can get that to you before opening day. So I want to just say a big thanks to Jay Richards, a very interesting presentation. And I think we all know what we've got to do if this comes up again with this control that's coming down everywhere. And thanks, Jay, for your message of your great book, and watch for that link on Empower You Ohio to go out and get your own. I just encourage you to go out tonight, make somebody's day in a good way, and always empower you.